Greetings, everyone. My name is Robert Martin. I'm the former director of the Bard College Conservatory of Music, and it's my pleasure to serve as moderator. Today's lecture is entitled Tradition as Constraints or Resources, and our speaker is Professor Hingyan Chen. This will be the third of 4 lectures, which together constitute the first phase of our project called Ink Art and Music. At the heart of our project is the idea that 7 new pieces of music will be created in the next year, all for an ensemble from the Bard Conservatory that combines traditional Chinese instruments with Western instruments. 3 of these pieces will be written by composers, one of whom is already well known and widely performed, our speaker for today, Professor Hingyan Chen, and 2 of whom have completed their studies and are well on their way to great success. Yiwen Shen, who will speak next week, and Yongping Chen, who presented the second lecture. The other 4 composers are currently students, 2 from Hong Kong University and 2 from the Bard Conservatory, and I will introduce them now. Olga is a composer and sculptor born in Beijing, China, living now in Tivoli, New York, and a 3rd-year student in the Bard Conservatory and Bard College with a 2nd major in studio arts. Austin Leung is a recent graduate of the Royal Academy of Music in London and now a PhD student in composition at Hong Kong University. Jing Wang received her bachelor's degree in Beijing, her master's at the Hochschule für Musik und Tanz in Cologne, Germany, and is now also a PhD student in composition at Hong Kong University. Samuel Mutter is a composer, pianist, and trumpeter with a strong interest in film music, now in his 2nd year in composition at the Bard Conservatory. These students are key to the project, and we look forward with excitement to hearing the pieces they will write. We will turn to them for questions at the conclusion of the lecture. Our project grew out of the creation in 2017 of the US-China Music Institute of the Bard Conservatory, and in particular, the decision to include the teaching of traditional Chinese instruments in the curriculum of the conservatory. This decision rested especially on the possibility of new compositions for these instruments. Sometimes with Western instruments, the great tradition of Chinese music would thereby will be given new life by the next generation of composers and performers. Another interesting and unusual aspect of the project is the connection each new work has to Chinese ink art. The inspiration for this came from our composers, Yunping Chen and Hingyan Chen, but the expertise comes from our colleague, Dr. Leslie Ma, curator of ink art at the new museum M+, and which is a generous supporter of our project. We heard a wonderful lecture last month by Dr. Ma on the history and significance of ink art, a lecture full of suggestions of ways that music can connect with the aesthetic of ink art. It will be up to each composer to decide how to connect and perhaps which piece of ink art to take as inspiration. After today's lecture, the project continues next week with the 4th and final introductory lecture by composer Yiwen Shen, and then the compositional activity and mentoring of the students will begin in earnest. In April of 2022, the US-China Music Institute of the Bard Conservatory will devote its spring seminar to the subject of ink art and music. And in May of 2022, all 7 works will have their world premiere performances, first at Bard in the United States, and then at Hong Kong University, performed by the Bard Conservatory Ensemble. Before introducing our speaker, Hingyan Chan, let me briefly thank Sharon Liu and the Cultural Management Office of the Hong Kong University Music Department for expertly coordinating all aspects of the project, and the Asian Cultural Council, the Lee Hai-san Foundation, and the US Embassy in Hong Kong for generous financial support. Hingyan Chan studied first at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and later for his master's and doctoral degrees at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. He is a prolific and widely commissioned and performed composer of music of many genres, including opera. He has received many important awards, not only for his compositions, but also notably for his service as a leader of Hong Kong's cultural life and as a dedicated teacher and research supervisor. Some of his chamber music compositions are of special interest to our project. For example, his 2005 work, Whence the Wind Returns, for alto saxophone, accordion, double bass, dizi, sheng, and tsang, and his 2009 work, Thus Flows the Watery Muse, for sheng, violin, amplified qin, and piano. There are so many other interesting works and interesting things to tell you about Professor Chan, but I don't want to take further time from his lecture. Professor Chan, good morning.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you for your wonderful introduction, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this project. And I also have to thank Dr. Chen Yangping for asking me to join this project. I thank both of you. This lecture, I'm going to it will be in three parts. The first part, I'm going to talk about traditions and constraints for composer, and the second part, I will talk about musical gestures in Chinese music. The third part, I will talk in depth of a piece that I composed in 2019. Bob mentioned that piece, Thus Flows the Watery Muse. That piece, I will go analyze that piece and then talk about how I compose, how I create my materials for that piece. So the very first part, I'm going to talk about traditions and constraints. Now, I'm not an expert of in art. Thank you for Dr. Leslie Ma's wonderful lecture last month. It's very inspiring. But to begin this section, I just want to quote what this very famous Chinese painter, Zhao Wuji, he said that everybody is bound by tradition. Of course, he said that he's bound by two traditions. And what's inspiring about him to me is because that he stopped using Chinese ink painting, stopped practicing Chinese ink painting when he first went to Paris. Only in the 1960s, he started to pick up that again. And then he had some very interesting remarks about Chinese ink art. I think this is very, he's still bound by two traditions, even though he's quite a modernist himself. Now, this is what I wrote up for this particular lecture. When we deal with an ensemble with Western and Chinese instruments, there are two immediate questions: how to reconcile the differences between the two traditions, or is reconciliation indeed possible or not? I have the third question: or is reconciliation necessary? And I will try to answer these questions in this talk. Even for Chinese composers, most of them are much Western art music, Western classical music orientated. So they may come across this question as well, because this idea of having a composer composing music for musicians to perform is it's not very old idea in China. It's a very Western concept. Okay, this is taken from a book written by two Singaporean scholars. They said this is, of course, they are not criticizing Chinese instruments, but I think this statement quite highlights the common complaints I heard from composers who are trained with Western classical music background, saying that Chinese instruments the intonation are not precise. The tonal and dynamic range are so narrow because if you look at traditional Chinese opera, like the Peking opera, they're all high-pitched instruments. Even for Cantonese opera, only in the beginning of the 20th century, we incorporate some bass or mid-range instrument. Also about this is a major issue. Also affect all the so-called improvement of Chinese instruments over the past 70 or 80 years in China. Try to make instruments to play chromatic scales, to be able to perform the chromatic scales on these instruments. These are the impressions of Chinese instruments by Western trained musicians. Very common. If you talk to most of the Western most of even those composers in Hong Kong, they have that complaint when they were being asked to write for a Chinese ensemble or they were being asked to write for the Hong Kong Chinese Orchestra. They all have this complaint saying that how to work with these instruments, and then some even said that each one of them have their own temperament system, how to put them together. But making those comments is a very the background with the reason why they're making those comments because they are trained with Westerns. They are all very Western trained. I would say that because later on in this lecture, I will also mention about this improvement or so-called modern version of those Chinese instruments when they are being improved to play louder or to play the chromatic scales. Something are missing because of that. I will talk more on that when I show you the musical example. Intonation, dynamic, and chromatic notes. And I will address these issues as well when I show you the musical example. This is another excerpt I taken from a review. Tendon's Crunching Tiger Concerto, which is originally written for the cello and orchestra, and in a performance in Arizona, the erhu was being used as the solo instrument. But the erhu is so soft an instrument, so they amplify it. I have to say that it's not just for Tendon's this particular concerto, even for a lot of solo concerto composed for Chinese instruments by Chinese composers. Most of them amplify the instruments. Amplify only because the instrument is just too soft. And so a lot of the time, this amplification is decided at the spot when the instrument couldn't compete with the Western orchestra. I won't mind instruments being amplified on condition that the amplification is planned, and also on condition that you're composing material suitable for the instrument. Not if you for this particular piece, Crunching Tiger Concerto, because originally it's for cello. The music originally is for cello to match with the orchestra, not for the erhu. So a lot of these moments, let's say very wide range of register, which may not be suitable for the erhu to go with an orchestra. An erhu go with a piano may be fine, a small ensemble may be fine, but with a big orchestra that may not work. So I have to emphasize, I won't mind amplifications, but amplification should be planned ahead, and also for musical reason, not only because the fact that the instruments just couldn't compete with the orchestra, and then the performer found it at the spot. And my experience is that some performers they got used to having their instrument amplified so much when they play concerto. I had an experience back 4 years ago when I composed a piece for a soloist to work with a local orchestra. She insisted that she needs amplification, but I said no. When I compose, I know that for that particular piece, the erhu could come out without amplification. Eventually, I convinced her for both the performance in Hong Kong and for overseas performances, we don't need any amplification. And when I compose for instruments for Chinese, when I compose these so-called hybrid concertos or a piece for Chinese instrument and a Western orchestra, I never ask those instruments to be amplified. Just now I said that I include a third question saying that does reconciliation necessary? This Takemisu's this Takemitsu quote to me is quite means something, quite something for me, because I came across this quote when I was writing my doctoral thesis. My doctoral thesis is on Takemitsu's November Steps, a piece composed in 1967 for 2 Japanese instruments and a Western orchestra. And this is part of the program note he wrote about that particular piece. And he talked about almost giving up that project, but eventually he found out that a composer should not be occupied by such things as to how to blend the two traditions, how to blend these two traditions. In fact, what Takemitsu tried to do in that particular piece is by juxtaposing the two different cultures together to show how different they are. I think this is one way one approach a composer should consider, and should consider more. And because most of the so-called concerto nowadays for Chinese instrument, a lot of the time, let's say erhu concerto, the erhu imitates the violin, or Yangqin concerto, Yangqin imitates the piano or the harp. Why couldn't we compose a piece, a concerto, to show that the two different musical cultures are different? I think same with dealing with chamber ensembles, with a mixed chamber ensemble with both Chinese and Western instruments. This is taken from, this English translation is taken from the book Confronting Silence, a very interesting book, a selected collection of Takemitsu's writings. I suggest composers to read that because it's quite inspiring, especially for Takemitsu. He used a lot of traditional Japanese instruments in his film music and also in his instrumental music. Okay, I am not an expert in architect, but I.M. Pei is one of the architects I like very much. Not because he's Chinese, but I think he's a great architect. And one of his projects is this pyramid outside the Louvre Museum. I think it's a good example. I think back 20 years ago, I did a talk and I used this Louvre Museum as an example of juxtaposing the two different culture. And also, if you look at this pyramid, it used a different material. Could you imagine if I.M. Pei tried to imitate the original Louvre Museum, and trying to build something similar to that, or using the same material? That won't be that interesting. Now, I'm not an expert in architect, but for me, this is quite an interesting example and quite inspiring as well. And then I.M. Pei also talk about tradition. A lasting architecture has to have roots, I won't go into deep into details because I'm not an expert in this field. And in case, if you still think that working with two traditions are a kind of constraints for you, I'm showing you this quote that by Stravinsky. He emphasized that his freedom will be so much the greater, the more meaningful, if he tried to limit himself at the very beginning of his compositional project. This is what I always tell my students as well, because young composers always think that they need more instruments, they need more choices. But I always warn young composers that even for each of the commissions that I have had so far, there are also constraints. Not because of the instrument, like let's say the orchestra is going on tour, I couldn't use those percussion instruments that I need to use. These are all constraints, but constraints will make you more creative. Okay. Another quote from a American writer, very famous American writer. He said that style is not much a matter of choice. Rather, it's both a response to constraint and seizing of opportunity. Very often, constraint is an opportunity. Okay, if you still regard the limitation of the Chinese instrument as a kind of constraint, I hope these two quote will inspire you. Okay, we are going to move on to the second section of this talk. I'm going to talk about musical gestures. What I mean by musical gesture. This is taken from an essay I wrote for a conference back nearly 20 years ago. A lot of things happened in that conference, but I still remember this is one of my remarks. I said that many of the interesting musical gestures in traditional Chinese music are not just because there's a misunderstanding saying that Western music. This is a very cliche saying that Western music is harmony, Chinese music is melody, African music is rhythm. This is very cliche saying, and so that a lot of composers, even Chinese composers themselves, they thought that. Think that what they need to do in a composition is melody. But in fact, it's not just melody, because those melody are interesting is because of those musical gestures. Those so-called musical gestures are these minute change, the tempo or pitch changes achieved by fingering or performing techniques, many of which are improvisatory. And these changes may happen within one note or between different notes. I hope this will inspire you when you listen to Chinese music again, or listen to any kind of Chinese music again. Now, I'm going to show you an example here. This is a erhu musical gesture. I play the erhu myself, and also because of copyright issue, this passage is performed by me. Okay. Now, this fragment is taken from the very famous erhu classic, the Erquan Yingyue, the moon's reflection on the second lake. Now, in ethnomusicology, we have two kinds of note. We talk about two kinds of notation or the way to notate music. This is one is descriptive, the other one is prescriptive. And just now you see that in the score, it's very prescriptive. It's not descriptive. It's not descriptive at all, because a lot of the portamentos, most of the portamentos are not notated in that score. And what I want to show is that without the portamentos, with all these very subtle change of timbre or pitch bend, that melody is uninteresting at all. Could you imagine taking out all those musical gestures? Now, back in 1998, when I first came back to Hong Kong, I did a piece for orchestra and erhu, in which many of the gesture of that erhu part, I was inspired by this kind of portamento performance on the erhu. This is a piece I composed in 1998 for the Sinfonietta and two soloists, a cello and an erhu soloist, two soloists, and then the piece is called Enigmas of the Moon. It's in 5 movements. This is the beginning of the first movement. Now the erhu was not amplified, and I basically it's just on the first position. So if you're talking about the instrument doesn't have enough notes for you to use, very narrow range, I basically just use one position. But I in my notation I specify all these different ways to do the portamento as well. Let me play you this first movement. This very first movement, I deliberately use the erhu to go with the brass section. People may complain saying the brass instruments are too loud for the erhu. Now I demonstrate to them this is possible. So erhu not being amplified, erhu basically stay in the first position. I start off the composition not with melody, but with gestures, musical gestures. So that's what I meant by the why, how to compose with this, how to create my music with these very interesting gestures, which I think are the essence of Chinese instrumental music. The next example I'm going to show, musical gesture example I'm going to show is on the Chinese bamboo flute. Unfortunately, I don't play the instrument, so this time I have to use musical excerpts to show you. The musical gesture I want to show you is called Dok Yam in Cantonese. When I try to search this Dok Yam in the internet, it appears as a Dao Yam, and so some very a lot of other things have appear on the internet. Dok Yam is Dok Yam, and translated into English is chopped notes. This Dok Yam is a very idiomatic way to play these pieces from the north. And it comprises two elements. One is the very short melodic note, and also a very sharply accented, high-pitched grace note. So it's not any note, any grace note can work. The Dok Yam, the grace note has to be higher pitched than the melodic note, and it has to be sharply accented. And this high-pitched grace note usually is produced by uncovering most, if not all, of the finger hold. Now here is a very short example I caught from a video. I may need to replay this a few times to demonstrate this to you. This is the Dok Yam. This is boop. This is a gesture. Let me. If you can see just pay attention to the Dizi performer's hand when he did did the dog yum. That he just uncovered most of the hole, and then all of a sudden doing this very sharply accented grace note, and then is the melodic note. So one more time. So this is the dog yum. So if you don't know the instrument, if you just try to compose pitch, the Western trained composer, a lot of the time when they do composition, they only think about pitch, or start with pitch, but because the whole training system all start with pitch, harmony, counterpoint, and but I have to say that with Chinese instrument, you have to think about the performing technique. I don't have examples here when I teach my students. Whether it's in a Chinese music course or whether it's in a composition course, I always one example I use very frequently is that the pipa, the pluck lute. They are more than they're not just one way to play tremolo. In Western instrument, tremolo is just tremolo, but on the pipa, there's so many different ways to play tremolo. If you don't specify on your score, you let the performer to do it to choose. You let the performer to choose it. It may not be the most satisfactory outcome for your composition. So I always advise my students to really study those instruments, and also the way to study may not be the best way may not be analyzing contemporary work. You may need to go back to these traditional pieces, really study those in depth, those solo pieces, and then you get to know those tricks. Another way, of course, you should make friends with good musicians. Always make friends with good musicians. They will tell you, performers, they will tell you the tricks, especially for Chinese instruments. The piece I'm going to show you is a piece I composed also in 1998. I was then commissioned by the Hong Kong Arts Festival, and I contributed 3 compositions. This is one of them. And I chose the instrumentation myself. I deliberately chose to use violin and Chinese bamboo flute. And for this particular piece is in 3 short movements. It lasts for about 8 minutes long, so very short movements. And the bamboo flute player has to use 3 different kinds of bamboo flute for this performance. And I deliberately chose that because each bamboo flute has its own color, own performing techniques to explore as well. So so here is an excerpt. Now this is the dog yum I notate on the score. This is the excerpt. Now this is not the performance from 1998. The piece was repeated in year 2019. This is a performance from 2019. in the score I said for amplified violin and amplified diesel. That was back in 1998 in the performance. It was performed in a concert hall. So I worry that many of the minor change of those timbre, like even for the violin, this pizzicato and then glissando and diesel, those grace notes. I worry that it's not loud. It was not loud enough. So I requested both instruments to be amplified. So it was planned, and for the recent performance, it was not amplified because it's in a very cozy museum. In a very cozy museum. In fact, this is the Asian Cultural Council, the museum there performed. So this is the second example of the second so-called musical gesture that I would like to show you. Now, in preparing this PowerPoint, I came across this local Hong Kong very famous ink art painter, Lui Shou-kun. He's regarded as a modernist in Hong Kong, and he was very active in the 1960s and 70s. He said that creating is a goal and the source is rooted in the origin. That is the foundation of learning. I would suggest my students to go back to those. Just now I said that you should go back to those traditional pieces, really to know the instrument well, to know those musical gestures, how to produce it, before you really move on to those contemporary works. This is, I think, Lui Shou-kun means the same thing here. Okay, now this is the third section. I'm going to go deep into one particular piece. Why I chose this piece is because this piece was commissioned by Cornell, the then Cornell violin professor, Dr. Joseph Lin. He, for that particular project in Cornell, there was an ink art exhibition to go with the performance of this piece and also other pieces as well. And in fact, that Erhu excerpt I showed you earlier, I performed on the Erhu. It was from this particular project as well. I was asked to do an Erhu solo for the performance. This is a piece in 4 movements. The reason why Joseph asked me to compose for this very strange. I think now even in this world nobody has had a piece with this instrumentation. I have a guqin, the 7-string sitar, very soft instrument, so I have to have it. I had to have it amplified in the performance, and also the Chinese mouth organ, the sheng, and also violin. Joseph played the violin, and also he also brought in a pianist from mainland China to join the project. Joseph he was a Fulbright scholar he spent many years in China to study Chinese music. He's a very enthusiastic musician, and he would like to know more about Chinese music, and that's why he brought in all these musicians from China to more or less like what we are doing now for this particular project. So when I got the commission, I started to plan my piece. So I plan in such a way that only the beginning movement and the ending movement I have all the instruments, and in between there are 2 duets. That's how I plan my composition. I try to have different groups of instruments to interact with each other. You may say that I'm trying to stay away from the problem, but this is one way to do your composition. If you look at Mahler symphony, a lot of the time there are small groups of small chamber groups to do in the middle movements, and only in the major movements, the center, the outer movements, he used the full orchestra. It's the same concept. I also plan in such a way the beginning movement. I have the guqin in the foreground, so the guqin is doing all the solo, and I quote 2 fragments of 2 Qin music from the Ming Dynasty, from a Ming Dynasty anthology. And then the second movement, I have the sheng in the foreground, and also the sheng has the piano with to go with him, And also the third movement, I have the violin. I pose a very kind of challenge for myself that I devised this challenge for myself to compose something for the violin and the guqin. So the two instruments are so different. And then the final movement, I have everything, every instruments playing, all the instruments playing, and then I also throw fragments of Handel's Water Music because the piece is about water. And if you notice the Chinese subtitles of this piece, all the characters have the water sign there. So that's how I create it. But this talk is not about creating subtitles. So just to show you how I plan the composition. So now this is the first movement. The first movement, I start with the violin in a very high pitch, doing a kind of circle music itself. These fragments just repeat. And then when the first fragment of violin high pitch material finish, I have the mouth organ doing wind sound on the instrument, not even playing the instrument. Only here he plays a chord here. And then after the second fragment high pitch violin high pitch materials, I have the piano comes in, doing a kind of gesture like a low pitch muted violin inside the piano technique. And then the qin comes in. Now, qin player, if you ask them to count, if you ask them to follow the conductor, usually they are not trained in that way. So the reason why I compose it in this way is it's easier for it's kind of compatible with the musicians I was working with. So they for this particular qin player back in 2009, she could read these notation, but for the recording I made earlier, the qin player had to brought back the original notation. Let me show you. This is the qin notation. I just enlarged here. I just enlarged this green part here. This is the qin phrase here, and then I specify the notation, Rabin tuning, the particular tuning for the qin, and then I also saying that where this fragment came from, more or less like quoting something when I write a scholarly essay. Here I footnote it, and the original notation is like this. In the recording we did last month, you will watch that video. The qin player had to use this notation. He just put this side by side with this in order to coordinate with the rest of the ensemble. So when you write for Chinese instrument, make sure that, especially for the qin, not all the qin player can work just like a Western musician in an ensemble. Of course, they are very good qin player. I shouldn't use the word good. They are qin player. They can read both notation, and then they are comfortable with working with contemporary music. Now this is the beginning of the first movement. I will play a fragment of it. Now, this is the beginning. So I didn't ask the Qin to compete with the piano. I try to make good use of the Qin gestures, the Qin materials. And the second half of this is I quote another piece. Just now is from one particular Qin piece. I quote another piece which is also about water. This piece is also about water. Very famous classics of the Qin. And then I come the ending of this movement. I come back with the same piece. Now let me play you this. Now the next fragment, the next excerpt I'm going to show you is the second movement I composed for the shang and the piano. The shang and the piano. The shang, there are lots of misunderstanding of the shang. People always say the shang can play harmony, but in fact, in traditional shang, those are not really harmony. Those fourth and fifth. They are in fact acting a color to a particular note rather than harmony. A lot of time when composers write for the shang, they try to do. So they just don't consult the shang manual. These are shang manuals I collect from my for my music shang player friend. Now this one is from my undergraduate years. The one on the left from my undergraduate years. I'm still keeping it. This is for 21 pipe, 21 reed D shang in D. So not complete chromatic scale. For a long time over the past 20 years, I insist on composing just for this model of the instrument. I don't need the chromatic scale. But nowadays, my shang friend, he switched to this 37 reed, which is completed with chromatic notes. But still, you need to know the fingering in order to make sure the chord that you composed is playable on the shang. If you ask the shang to play this G together with this G sharp, it's impossible because they are it's possible. But if this G go with this C, it may not be possible because they are controlled by the same finger or the thumb here in this case. I'm writing another piece for a Singaporean shang player. He showed me this 26 pipe shown the menu for that. So I need to know this because of over the past 50 or 60 years, the Chinese instruments have been undergone all these so-called improvements. So these instruments are still not yet standardized. I need to know that. Now this is my own drawing of my when I do the composition. I need to know which fingers goes with which pipe. This is the second movement. I used all these very typical chords of fourth and fifth, and then from that I generate this gesture of major second, because if you this fifth and this fourth, you have a major second fragment here. So everything just generate from this gesture here. And also I asked the Sheng player to sing and play again at the same time, and tongue click with the beginning. Let us listen to a fragment of this. Now the chin, because the third movement is for the chin. If I don't know whether you know the structure of the chin, on the side, along the side of the chin, there are 13 studs, which we call fai or hui in Mandarin. These are harmonic markers, and there are 13 of them. So if the chin put this way, and then I need to talk about this because when I plan the third movement, I know the tuning of the instrument because I quote those chin pieces. So I really draw up this table to know the possible harmonics with this tuning. So this is called the Rabin tuning, and there are only four possible. If I want to do this 3-note harmonic clusters, there are only 4 possibilities. So E, F, F sharp, F sharp, G, A, B flat, B. So it's not fully chromatic. Not all 12 notes among the chromatic scale can contribute to a 3-note harmonics here, because some of the notes are missing here for this particular tuning on the chin. So I won't ask the chin to retune it, or I won't complain saying that the chin is so underdeveloped. So I will have to work with it. So the gesture I have is this cluster-like gesture is a punctuation throughout the whole movement. Now this is the punctuation. So not just the cluster; it's the ending of it. There's this portamento gesture, very chin, and also all the notes of these the cluster is played as a harmonic. Listen to this again. So this is not enough. I had my inspiration from 2 other chin gestures, or 2 other chin performing technique. One is called the fork. This is the stopping, abruptly stopping the vibrating strings. This one. This is the fork. Another gesture is this fai oi. Fai oi is this one here. Is to have the left hand finger, whatever finger, glides on a string, playing string, and from its previous position indicate down to the outside 13th fret to the very, very left-hand side. So this is the fine oil. So this is the fine oil gesture. Now listen to it again. So in this movement, this is just one page of music. So I have this cluster, this G F sharp F cluster here. This the B flat A cluster here, and also ending with the F sharp F E cluster. I chose this so that this is further away from each other, having this one to end the piece here, to end this movement here. This is the gesture, ending gesture, the portamento gesture of each of these figures, and also this fork, the stopping the string also end here, and also this fine oil here. Now let's just listen to this movement. I think I just stop here because of time. Bob, I think I can answer the question now. I have more video, but let us play it when we have time.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's really wonderful, really rich and wonderful. I so admire you. You gave so much practical advice, really helpful. I had the feeling you opened the door to the workshop. You let us look inside to see how you do it. It's very, very inspiring. Thank you. But I want to turn right away to the students and give them a chance. Maybe, I don't know, Jing, if you have a question, may we start with you?
Sure. Hi. Hello,
Hi.
Ben. Hello, Bob. Professor Chen, you were talking about 古琴, which reminds me of something. I have seen a very interesting piece, which was a guitar solo, like several years ago, and the piece was performed horizontally, like 古琴, so like this. And there are all overtones in this piece, I would say, and it was soft but beautiful. However, you can't play a note on guitar with such long tail like 古琴, right? So some of the audience thought it was quite bored, and some guitarists thought the instrument didn't perform like the way of guitar which was supposed to do. But as a composer, I do understand the creation or challenge that a composer wanted to try out. For mixed ensemble, some pieces I've heard before. For example, the composers imitated the effect of erhu on violin. In this case, the violin sounds like erhu, just sounds like erhu somehow. But of course, they're totally different. But that way could be a primary way of supporting the piece. Of course, there are a lot of possibilities on mixed ensemble, but this case does happen very often. So I'm wondering, how do you think of the phenomenon?
I wouldn't mind composers using an instrument to imitate the other. There are Chinese instruments like there are pieces in which the erhu try to imitate the sound of a pipa, or the pipa try to imitate the sound of a guzhang, or the guzhang try to imitate the pipa. And or nowadays, of course, you can use the violin if you compose the violin trying to incorporate again gestures, Chinese music gesture onto your instrument. It's fine. But my philosophy is that you can do it, but for my own philosophy is that you can't sustain a long piece with just that idea. You can't just use the violin all the time to imitate the erhu. You need other materials. Like here, I only talk about for all these examples I show you. I only talk about how I dealt with the Chinese instruments. I didn't talk about how I dealt with the Western instruments. That you need more materials for that. But of course, there are composers who insist on doing some particular things. Like some composers just minimalism. Some composers just exploring this so-called spectral music. But it's fine. I think you can try anything. What I want to show students or to audience in this particular talk is that when you compose for Chinese instrument, don't complain about the instruments first. Don't complain saying that it doesn't have loud enough in terms of the sound. It doesn't have enough notes. It couldn't play chromatic scale. You have to know the instrument first. Know what the instrument is best for first, instead of asking the erhu to play artificial harmonic. Artificial harmonics on the erhu are never effective. Or most of the time when the performance is they amplify it. But if you want the whole ensemble to do artificial harmonics, it's crazy. So to answer your question, I won't mind. I think a healthy atmosphere is that everybody can do whatever they want with the instruments. But what I want to show in this lecture is that know the instrument first before you complain about it.
Jing, do you want to have a follow-up question or
I'm
comment?
Good. I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, good. Well, we'll come back. Samuel, how about you? Do you have a question?
Yeah, hello everyone. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Hi, Professor Chen. Thank you so much for this. It was a really informative presentation. I really appreciate it. So my question is, so one of the things I love about the traditional Chinese instruments and the music is, and one of the things I'm most excited for when working with these instruments is the improvisatory abilities that the musicians seem to naturally have with those instruments, something that I think is often lacking in classical Western trained performers. But I was curious to know if you've perhaps worked with any Western jazz musicians at all and tried combining that kind of style of playing and improvisation with the Chinese improvisation at all.
I haven't worked with jazz musicians before because I don't think I know that genre good enough to do it, and also I haven't had that opportunities neither. But when we talk about improvisation in Chinese music, just be careful which group of musicians or which musician you're talking to. If you have certain kind of improvisation in mind, make sure the instrumentalist that you are going to work with knows that particular improv. Like say if you're talking about Cantonese music, if you ask a Shanghai somebody who was trained in Shanghai or in Beijing, they may not know Cantonese music well. If you want the Hong Kong musicians to improvise in Jiangnan Sizhou silk and bamboo music of the Jiangnan province, then Hong Kong musicians may not be good at doing that. So make sure, even if you're talking about to a very experienced erhu player, you want to do, let's say if you're talking to a Taiwan musician, expect that this Taiwanese musicians would know how to perform this 歌仔戏, 歌仔戲 the kind of regional opera. No, most of the erhu player they didn't know 歌仔戲 because most of the erhu player they are nowadays they are conservatory trained. They didn't know the kind of operatic improvisation well enough, or even they have never practiced that neither. My philosophy is that I always have to be very careful when I ask for improvisation, because you are talking to people. The most cliche improvisation one can have is you ask a pipa player, ask them to go onto stage and do improvisation. Every time when they do climax, they just do this Submit My Folk or all these martial pieces from the repertoire. It sounds like cliched. So I have to be very careful when deal with improvisation. And I think there are possibilities. There are good possibilities. I'm sure there are good possibilities, but it has to be handled with care. This is my suggestion. And I have seen some erhu player trying to play jazz. In fact, they are not playing jazz. They memorize. They memorize one version and then they go and play. They went and play with the ensemble. That's not jazz. I haven't seen one real erhu player really play with live jazz. A lot of the time they just memorize the melody. So this is still a possibility, a very good possibility. I think nothing interesting has been done. That's my understanding.
So Austin, your turn. We'd love to hear your question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Martin, and thank you very much, Professor Chen Hingyan. Yeah, so I have a question actually first regarding the instruments of the Chinese instruments, because I feel like sometimes when I work with the Chinese instrument, it's just so complicated, because even for the deji, for the flutes, for smallest flutes, even if it's normally said to be one instrument, but it's actually in different keys. So, example, whenever I have a pitch for maybe a bangdi, like those very high flute instruments, but there's actually like bangdi in F, in B flat, in E flat, so different keys. So it's very tricky, I would say. When I just try to learn one instrument, it will already. I just can't figure out any systematic way to
I didn't mention that. In fact, for Chinese, these is very complicated. Back in the 1960s or 70s, there were dizi player try to add keys like the Western flute keys onto the dizi. Eventually, it didn't work. Nowadays, dizi player, if they need to play different key, they change instruments. And the reason why this is so difficult is because the most interesting gesture. Let's say if a piece is can be played by a dizi in F, and also can be played a dizi in G, or can be played by a dizi in C. You have to find the best one. The answer usually is the gestures, the performing techniques. Just now, let's say for the dok yum, the chopped notes that I talk about, if you use a C dizi to play, it's playable. But if you use a F dizi to play, it's not playable at all. You can't do those dok yum. So I don't feel comfortable when all these professional Chinese orchestra, they put on the internet saying that, writing for Chinese, these are the range. It doesn't answer the question, because knowing the range doesn't help you. Because of course you can. I pick this dizi. If your piece is in G, you think that in G, I just pick a G bangdi to use. It may not be the best solution. If you look at this very famous dizi player, Gan Guangyik, he passed away already, but he is very fond of using the E bangdi to play in A. The reason why he did that, because of all the interesting fingering that this E bangdi is possible. So he didn't use the A bangdi to play A. He deliberately, most of his compositions are in A, but he used a E bangdi to play it because of the fingering. So the way to learn it is to go dig deep into those traditional pieces, or those very effective traditional pieces, and then to know why a particular DJ is being used for that particular composition. That's the way to learn it. That's how I learned it. Like also, there's no manual for you. You have to really work with musician. Really go. Don't think that okay, my piece is mostly in G. I just pick the G bounty. Most of the time, you will be in deep trouble. Yeah, or you won't get the best out of it. So when I compose for chamber work and also orchestral, when I use Chinese bamboo flute, I always specify which dizi they need to use. I won't just give them the score. I specify which dizi I want to use. You need to learn this. Otherwise, you won't get the best out of those instruments.
Professor, do you think this is kind of a progress of evolution? Because if we recall in the past in the Western instruments, for example, the trombone, the trumpets, or maybe even the horn, etc., they have like different keys. But I mean, I know this is because of the natural harmonics, etc., so that they can play some pitches. But do you think in some days, maybe I don't know, in the future, the Chinese instruments will be more standardized and yeah, sort of like this, so it will make it easier to. I mean, I know it will lose a lot of effects or maybe a lot of like interest, like gesture in it. But what do you think of this standardizing progress maybe in the future?
Let me ask you a question. Do you want Chinese cuisine to be standardized? There's one Chinese cuisine. There's no Shanghai cuisine. There's no Hong Kong cuisine. There's no Sichuan cuisine. Do you want that? Okay. Okay. Now, I think the modernization is in progress. We can't change it. I think it's fine with the modern Chinese orchestra, people trying to do this chromatic to Western harmony. Fine, I think. But I don't want to see those traditional performing techniques missing in the future. I don't want to see that. I don't want to see that. But if you look at Western, I perhaps we shouldn't make a knowledge of that. But in Western music, we still have this Renaissance ensemble where this Baroque ensemble, and then we have the modern Chinese. Even for classical music, you have this somebody go back to Beethoven's tuning, all these things. And I think that one bad thing with Chinese instrumentalists, they always think it's an improvement. So you just rule out all the previous versions. That's bad. I don't want to see that. Okay, if you in future there are a DJ player who can play everything in one DJ, fine with me. But I still want this player to be able to perform all those traditional gestures as well. And that's the reason why I try not to use the modern sheng with the chromatic scale, because by adding all the pipes, you're changing sonority of the mouth organ, and also some of the traditional gestures are not available on those modern versions. It sounds like more like an accordion or a mini organ rather than a mouth organ, Chinese sheng. Yeah. So I won't against people doing that, but I don't want to see those traditional gestures disappearing in future.
Yeah. Very good, interesting. So Olga, it's your chance, and then if we have time, we'll go back and have more questions.
Thank you, Professor Chan, for the really informative lecture. I think I learned a lot, and I also really appreciated where the discussion just went, and I just kind of want to follow up with the conversation we just had now. For the gestures you're picking, where you showed us in the lecture today, did you all sort of, are they all traditional gestures? Where I'm thinking, are these like all sort of common practice traditional, like did you find them out in the sort of traditional repertory? And I'm just curious about like, what do you think about like sort of these sort of traditional gestures versus things that you just work with players and you ask, can you do this? And, kind of some like equivalent of what they call extended technique, just the techniques that are within the practice versus the techniques that you kind of, some kind of weird noises they can make. And how do you kind of balance that two kinds of gestures? One is kind of like you just found out the player can do this, and or do you kind of incorporate both of them in your practice?
Okay. I think it's just like to answer part of your question. It's just like in Western art music, Western classical music. Not every musician is fond of contemporary music. Just to be honest, not every musician is fond of contemporary music. Not every musician is very open-minded to new possibilities. Now, again, I have to emphasize this lecture doesn't mean that you have to just work with traditional gestures. You can always, of course, you can ask an erhu player to try bow behind, or to do this noise or pedal tone. This I did pedal tone on the erhu before as well. Again, I want to emphasize is that there are a lot of interesting gestures in the traditional repertoire. Knowing them well will just make you a better composer. Knowing them well will help you to ask better questions, to make more a smarter request from the musicians. Otherwise, if you ask the erhu player to play triple forte on the third position, it's impossible. It's impossible. If you have to know the limitation of the instrument as well. And then about striking a balance between using traditional gestures and exploring extended techniques. I think that depends on your knowledge and also your taste. That depends on your knowledge, your taste, and your talent. But to prepare yourself, you need to know the traditional gesture as much as you can. You need to acquire those knowledge as much as you can first before you explore those extended techniques. That's my suggestion. You don't need, if you don't need, you don't have a basic knowledge about the violin, how dare you ask them to don't use the bow and then do other things. You need to know all the possibilities. Okay, I want to go beyond that. I want to. You may not need to do well with those traditional traditional gesture, but at least you know the possibilities. That's my advice.
Thank you. Yeah. So just to clarify, so all the techniques you've shown.
Yeah, these are
in
all very
Sure.
standard. Very standard.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. And can I just follow up very briefly?
Please, yes, of course.
As for, you showed the traditional notation for guqin.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's a special case where
Okay.
is qin sort of the special instrument that has
Qin is
own-
very special. Qin has
Okay.
been a instrument of the Qin was the instrument of the literati, so it had its own notation system. But nowadays, Qin player, most of them, they can read Western staff notation together with some the fingering techniques are on those ideogram notation in the bottom of the notation. Most of the Qin player, they can read a Western notation. Even for the Qin player I worked with last month, even though he need to refer to the original notation, he was just not confident enough with the because this was the first time he performed. I think it's the second or third time he performed with a contemporary ensemble. He's just basically a traditional Qin player, and I learned the Qin when I was in my undergraduate years, but I didn't play it well. So I learned it because as a composer, I think I learned the clarinet before. I also learned the double bass before because I just want to know the instrument better, to write for them. The more you learn, just help you to do better composition. This is my advice to students. Qin is a very special case because Qin has, throughout history, Qin has its own notation system.
Yeah, I want to give the students still a chance. Anybody have a further question or a follow-up? Yeah, who is that? Austin, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Martin. And yeah, actually, I have some thoughts about the extended technique and the like a traditional Chinese technique. I feel like the reason that we need extended technique in the classical repertoire is because we have heard the violin sound or maybe some of the traditional sound too much. So in every piece they sound kind of the same, and we're bored of these like sounds. But maybe what I think about Chinese instrument is we're not bored yet because there are still a lot of like techniques that we haven't discovered and that we haven't explored. So maybe I think regarding the balance between extended techniques and the traditional sound, maybe after we explore enough the traditional sound, we can like look for the extended techniques. Or what do you think? Like, yeah.
I won't say that. Okay, I won't. Again, my advice throughout this lecture is that there are a lot of interesting things. I won't say that there are enough, and then we don't need to develop. But I have seen too many occasions on which composers complain about the musicians, complain about the instruments. So that's why I think you have to have the right attitude first, and then whether you okay, maybe I think there's no one standardized way to learn composition. Maybe after 1 year you're bored with the traditional gesture on the pipa. You try to, if you have a very good friend who plays the pipa very well, you just work with them and then try to explore those things. I just let you just do whatever you like. But my advice is that you have to know and have some basic knowledge of the instruments and what are the essence there. And a lot of people think that, oh, I'm going to compose for the erhu. I tell you a story. There's a very famous piece on the erhu repertoire, which is it's called River Water. It's a set piece. If in the Western terminology, it starts with C as Do, and then in the middle, no, it starts with B flat as Do. Okay, you may say in B flat. It's not in major. It's in B flat. We say that, and then in the middle, it switched to C, Do in C. It's a very strange modulation if in the Western classical music sense. I heard a transcription, not transcription, a rearrangement of the piece for erhu and orchestra. It starts again with B flat, but in the middle, it changed to G minor. Of course, you know that this composer is Western trained. G major, G minor to G major. Okay, G minor to G major. B flat is G minor, but by doing it in G major, you lost all the fingering possibility of the C tonality there. You need to know that in order not to do it. If you are asked to make the arrangement, you won't make that stupid decision of modulating from B flat to G. So oh my God, the O couldn't do all the very interesting portamento and also the open string. Open string is very important. If you look at Bach's partita and sonata, try to play them in C sharp. You couldn't use all the open string anymore. If you look at the Bach's partita and cello suite, they are in a particular key. In Bach's time, when they try to do different sonata, they use scottatura. They retune the string so that some of the gesture are still possible. This is something similar to what we change these for different key. So that's my advice and my observation. I may not be correct, but this is my observation and also from my experience.
Yeah, that's very, very good. I just want to say as a performer, how extremely important it is what you're saying, because a lot of it is building a trust. And when the performer sees that you care about the instrument and the traditional ways of playing it, then the performer is really willing, eager to try extensions. So much depends on that kind of trust, which comes from what you're saying exactly.
In fact, I have extra video. I can show you this one. These two videos. I have two, but I think I'm going to play one. These two videos are prepared for Bob, because Bob, when I met with him last week, he asked me about vocal music, voice music for the voice. Now I showed the video below. I didn't complain about the musicians who couldn't read Western note. This is I worked with a Cantonese opera singer. She couldn't. Although she played the male role, but she couldn't. She didn't work with a Western ensemble. So I didn't ask her to read the score. So I composed this fragment. I worked around with those fragments. I should to also answer Bob's question from last week. Let me show you this.
Okay, great.
最熟悉的也只是電車。人們記得電車悠悠的好處嗎？人們有時間記得嗎？
Okay, this is an excerpt from a cantata in the middle, and then there is narration, and also I incorporate this Chinese narrative singing style. I didn't ask the singer to read the score. Every time if you notice, every time when she entered, there's a Chinese instrument give her all the hints. So I know that. So I composed that, and then the conductor just cue that Chinese instrumentalist, and then that Chinese gave the cue to the singer, and then they join in. So that's how you work. I won't complain saying that this singer couldn't read Western notation, and she didn't need to watch the conductor, neither. Now,
Right.
she sings differently every time. If I compose everything for her, she has to follow the score. Then that kind of improvisation would disappear. So I think that's the way to work with, even for musicians who couldn't read Western notation. You have to find a way to work with them.
Yeah. It's wonderful. You know, it's a sign of a great lecture, a great event, that it's hard to end it.
Bob, the reason why I play you this, I insist to play this because I prepared the subtitle just for you, for all of you. Otherwise, I just waste my effort.
No, it's great. I come to Hong Kong to see more. No, it's really wonderful. And I wish we could go on. Thank you to the students. Thank you to Hingyan. It's really a fabulous gift you gave us today. Really rich lecture. And I look forward now next week. Remember, we continue.
Yes.
And the project continues. So I guess I have to say goodbye to everyone and thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Also, thank you for the questions. Yeah.
It was very good.